The decision was satisfying in its cruelty, delivered with the precision of a man signing a receipt. October 14th, 1876. The town hall of Briarstone smelled of stale tobacco and lamp oil, the kind of smell that sinks into wood and never leaves. Three men sat behind a long table made of Douglas fir. Caleb Hargrove had built that table 12 years ago. He remembered planing it smooth, running his thumb along the grain until it felt like glass under his skin. Now he sat behind it, and across from him stood the wife of his dead friend, and he could not bring himself to look at her face. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back. Not far, just a few hours. That same morning before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, Caleb Hargrove stood in his workshop on the edge of Briarstone, sharpening a hand plane on a whetstone. The rhythm was automatic. Steel on stone, back and forth, the sound like a whisper that only his hands understood. He had been doing this for 20 years. 20 years of sawdust and sweat of mortise and tenon of foundations dug exactly 2 feet deep, because that was the way it was done and the way it had always been done. His workshop was the one place in the world where everything made sense. Joints had to be tight. Corners had to be square. Wood had to be seasoned. There were rules, and the rules did not lie. On his workbench sat an unfinished chair. Red oak, 4 legs, a curved back, destined for the parlor of Henry Prescott, the banker who held the deeds to half the valley. Caleb ran his rough fingers along one of the legs and thought as he had thought every morning for 6 weeks about Thomas Calloway. Thomas had come to him 7 years ago, a boy of 16, all arms and no coordination. His first swing with an axe nearly sent the tool flying into the creek. Caleb had laughed a real laugh, the kind that comes from the belly, and clapped the boy on the shoulder. "Slow down," he had said. "Do not fight the wood. Let the axe talk to it." Thomas had learned. He had grown into a man with strong hands and a gentle disposition, the kind of man who would split a cord of firewood for a neighbor without being asked and never mention it afterward. He married a girl named Alara, a quiet, gray-eyed young woman who had come west alone and carried a leather-bound book everywhere she went like a talisman. Caleb had liked her from the start. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her words had weight to them, the kind of weight that made you stop and reconsider whatever you had just said. Thomas used to talk about her in the workshop, leaning against the bench with sawdust on his sleeves. His face lit up the way a man's face lights up when he has found something he did not know he was looking for. "Alara looks small," Thomas had said once, grinning, "but she is tougher than old Caleb." Her grandmother survived 3 winters alone in the Appalachian Mountains after her grandfather died. Nothing but a knife and what she knew about the earth. That kind of blood does not thin out. 6 weeks ago, a ponderosa pine fell in the wrong direction at the wrong moment, and Thomas Calloway was gone. They brought his body back on a plank of wood. Caleb recognized the plank. Thomas had planed it the week before, and he had planed it unevenly, a little too deep on the left edge. It was a habit Caleb had pointed out to him a dozen times. Thomas always grinned and said he would fix it next time. There would be no next time. The unevenness in the wood was the last imperfection Thomas Calloway would ever leave in the world, and Caleb could not stop thinking about it. Now there was a debt, $112 owed to Henry Prescott's bank, borrowed by Thomas to expand the cabin. Caleb knew about the debt because Caleb was the reason it existed. He had drawn the plans for the expansion himself, sitting at this very workbench with a pencil and a square sketching out the new room while Thomas watched with the eager attention of a young husband building something for the future. Caleb had estimated the lumber costs. He had said the words that set everything in motion. "Expand the place. You will need room for a bigger family. Go to Prescott. His interest is fair." Thomas and Alara had been hoping for a child. The new room was supposed to be a nursery. There would be no child. There would be no nursery. The cabin now belonged to Prescott's bank, and the young woman who was supposed to fill that room with life was about to lose the roof over her head, and Caleb Hargrove stood in his workshop sharpening a plane and building a parlor chair for the man who was taking everything from the wife of his dead friend. He set the plane down, picked it up, set it down again. The morning light came through the cracks in the workshop wall in long, thin lines, and the sawdust floated in them like tiny golden planets, suspended in space, and the world outside was beautiful and indifferent. The town hall was already filling when he arrived. Henry Prescott sat in the center chair, a man of 55 whose spectacles he adjusted constantly as though the world kept going slightly out of focus and he needed to bring it back into alignment. Prescott was not a cruel man. He was something more dangerous. He was a methodical man, a man who believed that order was the highest virtue and that debts were the architecture of civilization, and that a society which forgave its debts would collapse as surely as a building without a foundation. He had a wife, Dorothy, and two children, William, who was 9, and Annabeth, who was 5. He loved them completely. He provided for them absolutely. He did not see any contradiction between loving his own family and dispossessing someone else's. To Prescott's left sat Reverend Elijah Whitfield, a man of 50, whose voice carried the resonance of a church bell, even in casual conversation. His girth exceeded his height in a way that suggested a lifetime of Sunday dinners taken seriously. His wife Ruth suffered from a chronic weakness of the lungs that kept her confined to the house most days, and Whitfield had come to view all suffering as a test administered by a God who graded on endurance. He was not unkind. He simply could not imagine a world that operated outside the framework he had been taught, and within that framework, a young widow without means was a problem to be solved through charity, not through autonomy. Caleb took the third chair. He placed his thick, calloused hands on his knees and stared at the floorboards he had laid in this building 12 years ago. Alara Calloway entered the room, and the murmur of conversation died like a candle pinched between two fingers. She was 19 years old. Her hair was dark brown, tied back in a practical knot that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with keeping it out of her face while she worked. Her eyes were gray, the color of creek stones after rain, and they were steady in a way that made some people uncomfortable, because steady eyes in a grieving woman suggested a strength that did not fit the narrative that had already been written for her. She was thinner than she had been 6 weeks ago. The bones of her face were more prominent, her wrists narrower, the physical evidence of grief's appetite. She was an orphan, had been since she was 11 when fever took both her parents in the same terrible week in the mountains of Appalachia. She had been raised by her grandmother, Margaret Ashford, a woman of extraordinary resilience who lived alone on a ridge where the nearest neighbor was a 2-day walk, and who had survived 3 winters in that solitude after the death of her husband, with nothing but a knife, a leather-bound book of accumulated knowledge, and a stubbornness that bordered on theology. Margaret died when Alara was 16, and the girl went west because there was nothing left in the east, and she met Thomas Calloway at a trading post on the edge of the frontier, and they were married before her 18th birthday. She had no family, no network, no safety margin of any kind. Thomas had been everything, and Thomas was gone, and she stood before 3 men in a stuffy room and waited for the next thing to be taken from her. The funeral had been a small affair, a half-dozen people standing around a hole in the ground on a gray afternoon while Reverend Whitfield read from Scripture and the wind pulled at the pages of his Bible. Caleb Hargrove had stood in the back row, his hat in his hands, his face the color of old plaster. He had helped dig the grave that morning because digging was something his hands knew how to do, and because the alternative was standing still and thinking about the fact that the boy he had taught to swing an axe was now lying in a pine box that he, Caleb, could have built better than the one the undertaker had thrown together. And that thought was a door he did not want to open. Alara had stood at the graveside without weeping, and some of the townswomen had whispered about this, about the unnaturalness of a young widow who did not cry at her husband's burial. They did not understand, because they had never been orphaned at 11 and widowed at 19, that there are depths of grief that exist below the waterline of tears. Alara's grief was not smaller than theirs would have been. It was deeper. It had gone underground into the same silent places where the earth keeps its warmth, and it would stay there, sustaining her in ways that were invisible from the surface. 6 weeks had passed since that gray afternoon. 6 weeks of casseroles left on her doorstep by women who did not knock of averted eyes in the general store of the careful choreography by which a small town manages the presence of misfortune in its midst, acknowledging it enough to demonstrate compassion, but not so much as to risk contamination. And now the council had convened and the choreography had reached its final movement. Henry Prescott cleared his throat. In light of the outstanding debts of your late husband, Thomas Calloway, the council finds it necessary to reclaim the property. The cabin and the associated 160 acres are to be seized as collateral. The debt amounts to $112. The property's assessed value is $150. The town is being generous. Generous. The word occupied the room like an uninvited guest who refused to sit down. It hung in the stale air, and everyone heard it, and no one challenged it because challenging it would mean questioning the system that kept them all in their proper places. Reverend Whitfield leaned forward, his chair creaking under his weight. It is a sad providence, Alara, a test of your faith. But the laws of man, like the laws of God, must be respected. Order must be maintained. Caleb said nothing. His right hand lifted from his knee. Not much. An inch, perhaps two. The beginning of a gesture that his body understood even if his conscious mind had not yet approved the expenditure. He was going to raise his hand. He was going to speak. He was going to say something about the debt being partly his responsibility, about the expansion he had designed, about the lumber costs he had underestimated, about the words go to Prescott. His interest is fair that he had spoken in his workshop on a sunny afternoon when Thomas was alive and the future was a room waiting to be furnished. Then he saw Martha. She was sitting in the second row behind the table, his wife of 23 years. A quiet woman with steady hands and a practical intelligence that manifested not in speeches, but in the 10,000 small decisions that kept a household running. She was 45 years old, and she was looking at him with an expression that he had seen perhaps 4 times in their entire marriage, an expression that was not anger but something more potent, fear. Not fear for his safety, but fear for his judgment, fear that he was about to do something that his conscience demanded and that their circumstances could not afford. If Caleb spoke against Prescott, the furniture commissions would end. The building contracts would dry up. Prescott's financial tendrils reached into every corner of Briarstone, and a man who challenged the banker publicly would find himself subtly but effectively severed from the economic life of the town. And winter was coming, and Samuel was 7 years old, and their own debts, smaller than Thomas's, but real enough, would not pay themselves. Martha's eyes communicated a single terrible word. Please. Caleb lowered his hand. He placed it back on his knee. He looked down at the floorboards and stroked his gray beard and said nothing. And the nothing he said was the loudest sound in the room, though only he and Martha could hear it. The silence settled into him like a nail driven into green wood, one that would rust in place and never be extracted without tearing the grain apart. He had just committed an act of cowardice that was invisible to everyone, except the 3 people who mattered most: himself, his wife, and the young woman standing before the council. He knew it instantly, the way he knew when a joint was not properly seated, a wrongness felt in the bones of his hands, a flaw that would bear weight for now, but would fail under sufficient pressure. Prescott produced another document with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has done this many times before. The town and its charity offers you the use of the old trapper's shack down by Coulter Creek. It is on unclaimed land, but we will overlook the squatting for the season. For the season. The words were a clock with a very short spring. They meant until the snow melts if you are still breathing. The trapper's shack was a ruin that everyone in Briarstone had passed, and no one had entered for a decade. It leaned to one side as though exhausted by the effort of remaining upright. Its roof was a patchwork of split cedar and failing hope. Its single window had been broken so long ago that the glass had been absorbed back into the earth around the foundation like a memory the landscape had decided to forget. No one lived there. No one could live there. It was a waypoint on the trail to the creek. Nothing more a place where porcupines sheltered and where the wood slowly returned to the soil from which it had come. They were offering her a coffin and calling it charity. Alara Calloway looked at Henry Prescott. She looked at Reverend Whitfield. Then her gaze moved to Caleb Hargrove, and for one unbearable moment their eyes met. He saw in her gray eyes not hatred, not pleading, not the wet desperation he had braced himself for. He saw clarity. She had seen his hand rise. She had seen it fall. She understood the geometry of what had just happened, the precise angle of his betrayal, and she had measured it the way a builder measures a cut once accurately without needing to check again. I see, she said. 2 words. Quiet and level, and absolutely without inflection. She turned and walked out of the town hall, and the door closed behind her with a sound that was not loud but was final in a way that reminded Caleb of the last nail driven into a lid. The room resumed its business. Prescott adjusted his spectacles and shuffled papers. Whitfield murmured something about mysterious ways. Men in the back row cleared their throats and shifted in their chairs, relieved that the unpleasant portion of the meeting had concluded and that normalcy could reassert itself. Caleb sat behind the table for 10 minutes after Alara left. He heard none of what was said. He saw nothing but the floorboards between his boots. I see. The 2 words repeated in his mind with the steady rhythm of a hammer, striking the same nail over and over, driving it deeper with each stroke. She had not said them to Prescott. She had not said them to Whitfield. She had said them to the room and to him, and they were not an expression of acceptance. They were a verdict. That evening, Caleb moved through the rituals of domestic life as though watching himself from a distance. Martha served dinner. Samuel talked about a fox he had seen near the creek. The house was warm and solid, and everything in it was in its proper place, and none of it mattered, because behind every surface, in every shadow, in every silence between his son's sentences, he saw the gray eyes of a 19-year-old woman who had looked at him and understood exactly what kind of man he was. After Martha and Samuel went to bed, Caleb rose and walked to his workshop. He lit the oil lamp. The flame guttered and then steadied, casting long shadows across the workbench, where the unfinished chair for Prescott's parlor sat waiting. Red oak, 4 legs, curved back, beautiful grain. He picked up a chisel, set it down, picked it up, set it down. He could not work on the chair because working on it meant completing a commission for the man who had just taken everything from the woman his dead friend had loved, and he could not destroy the chair because destroying it meant consequences he could not afford. And so he sat there in the lamplight with his hands hanging between his knees, suspended between the thing he should do and the thing he could afford to do, and the distance between them was the exact width of his shame. He thought about Thomas coming to the workshop for the last time 2 weeks before the pine fell. The expansion was nearly finished. Thomas had been excited in the quiet way of a man who does not boast but cannot entirely contain his satisfaction. Alara is going to love the new room, Caleb. She says she will grow herbs on the windowsill just like her grandmother used to. His face had been lit up the way it always was when he talked about her, as though the very mention of her name turned on a lamp inside him. That room, Caleb's blueprint, Caleb's advice, Prescott's money, Thomas's hands. Now Thomas was dead and the room belonged to the bank, and the woman who was supposed to grow herbs on the windowsill was sleeping on bare dirt in a ruin by the creek. Caleb sat in his workshop until the lamp burned low, and then he sat in the dark, and when he finally went back to the house and lay down beside Martha, he stared at the ceiling and did not sleep, and Martha did not ask him where he had been, because she already knew. The shack was worse than memory. Alara stood before it in the gray afternoon light and took its measure with the same unflinching assessment she applied to everything. 12 feet by 14 feet, leaning to the south as though a strong wind had tried to push it over and it had simply lacked the energy to resist. Roof more whole than material. The single window, an empty socket. Inside, the space was dark and damp, the floor bare earth already cold to the touch. The walls a collection of planks with gaps between them wide enough to slide a hand through. The wind came in from every direction, a dozen small, cold fingers probing for the warmth she did not yet have. She unloaded her cart with methodical precision. The cast-iron cook stove, which she positioned in the corner furthest from the worst of the wall gaps. The bedroll. The box of kitchen implements. Thomas's tools, which she laid against the wall in the order he had always kept them: shovel, pickaxe, handsaw, spirit-level hammer. Each tool bore the marks of his grip, the wood handles worn into contours that matched his palms, and when she held them, she could feel the ghost of his hands inside her own. And the book. Her grandmother's book. Leather bound the cover, dark with age, and used the pages filled with Margaret Ashford's small, precise handwriting that slanted to the right like trees bent by a wind that never stopped blowing. It contained everything Margaret had known about the earth, about building, about surviving, when the world decided you were not supposed to. That first night was a lesson in the physics of cold. Alara wrapped herself in every blanket she owned and lay on the bare earth and felt the temperature of the ground rise through the thin fabric and into her bones with the patient inevitability of water filling a hole. She could not get warm, not because the air was impossibly cold. It was October and the true winter had not yet arrived, but because the earth beneath her was a reservoir of cold that no amount of covering could overcome. The ground was stealing her heat faster than her body could produce it, and she understood with a clarity that left no room for hope, that if she was still lying on this dirt in January, she would not be lying on it in February. She would be part of it. Frost came before dawn, painting the dead grass in strokes of white and silver, turning her breath into clouds that hung in the still air inside the shack, like small ghosts reluctant to leave. She lay on her back and looked up through the holes in the roof and saw the stars bright and hard and impossibly distant, and she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. She was alone. Not temporarily alone, not alone in the way of someone whose family is in the next room, but fundamentally, structurally alone, a woman with no living relatives, no connections, no money, no home, no claim on the sympathy of a community that had already decided she was a tragedy best observed from a distance. Thomas was gone. Margaret was gone. Her parents were gone. She was 19 years old, and the sum total of her assets was a cart, a stove, some tools, some blankets, and a book. In the darkness, she let herself grieve. Not loudly. Alara had learned early that sorrow is a private river, one that runs underground where no one can see it or comment on its depth. The tears came silently, and she did not wipe them. She remembered the warmth of Thomas's back against hers on cold nights, the way his breathing steadied when he fell asleep, the particular smell of pine resin and clean sweat that was uniquely his and that was already fading from the shirts she had packed. She remembered his laugh, which came easily and often, and which she would never hear again. She whispered into the cold, "Thomas said I inherited my stubbornness from grandmother. I am going to use it." Then she closed her eyes, and behind the grief beneath it, in the space where the mind does its most desperate and most creative work, a plan began to form. Not a complete plan, a shape, a direction, an impossible, audacious, physically overwhelming direction that was also the only direction left. Morning, October 16th. The sun had not yet topped the eastern ridge when Alara Calloway took Thomas's shovel and walked the perimeter of her domain. The shack sat on a gentle slope 50 yards from the bank of Coulter Creek. The creek was not wide, but it was deep and fast-moving, fed by a mountain spring higher up the valley, a spring that never froze entirely even in the deepest cold, because the water came from deep enough in the earth to carry the planet's own warmth. She looked from the creek to the shack. She looked at the slope between them. She looked at the earth beneath her feet, and she heard her grandmother's voice not as an echo or a memory, but as a presence, steady and unhurried, the voice of a woman who had outlived everything except her knowledge. "The earth has two hearts," Margaret used to say. "The fire heart deep below where the rock runs hot, and the warm heart just beneath the frost line where the temperature holds steady no matter what the sky is doing above. The earth gives warmth, child. You just have to know how to ask." Margaret had called it a warmth corridor. The principle was simple in the way that all profound principles are simple, which is to say that it was easy to state and staggeringly difficult to execute. At a depth below the frost line, which in these Montana mountains could reach 6 feet, the earth maintained a constant temperature of approximately 35 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. This temperature did not change regardless of whether the air above was 50 degrees or 50 below. Moving water held similar thermal stability. If you could create a channel connecting the thermally stable deep earth to the space beneath a dwelling, the warmer air from below would rise naturally into the dwelling while the colder, heavier air inside would sink and exit through a separate vent. Passive circulation. No machinery, no fuel, only the physics of convection and the ancient, patient warmth of the ground. The plan crystallized as Alara stood on the slope in the early morning cold, her grandmother's words mixing with the mathematical part of her mind that had always been sharper than anyone expected. She would dig a trench, not a foundation trench, but a long, deep channel running from beneath the center of the shack down the slope and all the way into the gravel bed of Coulter Creek, a distance of approximately 67 feet. The trench would need to be at least 8 feet deep at its lowest point, well below the frost line. It would need a precise, consistent gradient of 1 inch of drop for every 10 feet of length to ensure that the air would flow naturally without any assistance. At the creek end, the opening would be positioned within the thermally stable mass of the bank itself, drawing in air that was in constant contact with the deep earth and the moving water. Inside the shack, she would build a sealed chamber beneath a new wooden floor, a plenum that would receive the earth-warmed air from the trench and distribute it across the entire floor surface before the cooled air exited through a vent at the opposite end. The floor would not be heated exactly, but it would be prevented from freezing. The ground beneath her home would remain at a temperature that sustained life rather than ending it. And the difference between 38 degrees and 20 below zero was the difference between surviving the winter and becoming another frozen body in another unmarked grave. The volume of earth she would need to excavate was, by her rough calculation, between 40 and 50 tons. She had a shovel, a pickaxe, a pair of hands that had never done manual labor of this kind in approximately 6 weeks before the deep cold arrived. It was insane. It was the kind of plan that a team of strong men with mules and equipment would have found ambitious. For a lone woman with blistered hands and 48 cents, it was not a plan so much as a dare thrown in the face of probability. But probability had already taken everything from her. She had nothing left to lose except the effort. They left me dirt in a ruin, she thought, gripping the handle of Thomas's shovel, feeling the shape of his hands in the worn wood. I will use the dirt to save my life. The next morning, before the town was awake, Alara walked into Briarstone with her head up and her pace steady. She went to the general store owned by Emmett Burke, a man of about 60 who had the lean, watchful quality of someone who has spent a lifetime observing human behavior and has decided that the wisest response is minimal commentary. Emmett was one of the few people in town who had not offered Alara pity after Thomas's death. He had offered her a fair price on supplies and correct change, which she appreciated considerably more. She placed the gold locket on the counter. Thomas had given it to her on their first anniversary. Inside was a tiny pressed Edelweiss flower that she had carried from her grandmother's garden in the Appalachian Mountains, a piece of a world that no longer existed preserved in gold and glass. She received $7 for it. When she set the locket on the worn wood of the counter, her hand slowed. Not trembled, slowed, a hesitation so brief that most people would have missed it entirely. Emmett Burke was not most people. He looked at her face, read what was written there, and asked quietly, "Are you sure, Mrs. Calloway?" She nodded. Emmett weighed the locket open. It studied the tiny white flower for a moment, then closed it again with a gentleness that seemed out of proportion to a $7 transaction. He did not put it in the glass display case with the other jewelry and trinkets. He placed it in a private drawer behind the counter, beneath the register, where he kept things that were not for sale. He did not explain his reasoning, and Alara did not ask, and neither of them knew that this small act of unexplained preservation would matter enormously 5 months later. She purchased 20 rough-sawn pine planks, each 10 feet long and 1 foot wide, a boss of iron nails, 3 lengths of 6-inch diameter terracotta drainage pipe, the kind normally used for road culverts. The total came to $6.52. She had 48 cents remaining to her name. She arranged for delivery to the edge of town, which was as far as the delivery fee would cover, and then she began the slow, exhausting process of hauling 600 pounds of material down a mile of rough ground to a shack by a creek using a handcart and nothing else. It took 5 trips. The planks were the heaviest load, 4 at a time, laid across the cart, their ends hanging over the sides and catching on every rock and root along the trail. The terracotta pipes required individual trips because they were fragile and heavy, and the trail was uneven. And each time she lowered one off the cart at the shack, she held her breath because a crack in the pipe would mean a crack in the entire plan, and she did not have the money to replace even one section. On the last trip, carrying the nails and the few remaining supplies, the light was failing and the temperature had dropped enough to numb her fingers through her thin gloves, and she walked the final quarter-mile in near darkness, guided by the sound of Coulter Creek and the slightly less dark shape of the shack against the slightly dark sky. She stacked the planks inside against the wall where they would stay dry. She placed the terracotta pipes carefully on a bed of grass she had gathered cushioned against breakage. She counted the nails. She inventoried every resource she possessed with the methodical precision of a general assessing supplies before a siege, because that was what this was. A siege. The enemy was winter and it was already massing on the ridgeline. That same morning, Caleb Hargrove walked past the delivery point at the edge of town and stopped. The ground was churned where the planks had been stacked and then removed one by one. The ruts of a small handcart led away from the spot down the slope toward the creek, and Caleb stood there looking at them with the expression of a man reading a sentence in a language he thought he did not speak. His mind calculated automatically. It was what builders' minds did. 20 planks at roughly 25 pounds each, 3 terracotta pipes at about 40 pounds apiece. Total material weight close to 600 pounds. 1 woman, 1 handcart, nearly a mile of uneven sloping ground. He looked at the depth of the ruts and estimated the number of trips. At least 4, probably 5. He looked at the cart tracks for a long time. The word that came to his mind was not foolishness. It was something he did not have a name for, something that lived in the same part of his brain that recognized exceptional joinery, the part that knew quality when it saw it, regardless of who had produced it. He turned and walked back to his workshop. He had a chair to finish, And in the part of his mind where things were filed for later examination, a question took up residence. Why would a woman with 48 cents buy terracotta drainage pipe? That evening at dinner, Samuel talked about the fox again. Martha served stew. The kitchen was warm. The house was solid. Caleb ate and nodded and asked his son appropriate questions about the fox and kissed Martha on the forehead when she went to bed. And then he sat alone at the kitchen table in the house he had built, the tightest joints in the valley, and the question about the terracotta pipe sat with him in the silence like a second heartbeat. He could not quiet. Across the valley, in a shack that was barely more than a suggestion of shelter, Alara Calloway opened her grandmother's book by candlelight. The pages were soft with age and handling the margins annotated in 2 generations of handwriting, Margaret's slanting script overlaid with Alara's own smaller, neater notes in pencil. She found the page she was looking for, a description of the warmth corridor written in Margaret's practical prose, accompanied by a rough sketch of the cross-section, and at the bottom, in a different ink perhaps added years later, a note in the margin. The handwriting was slightly unsteady, as though the hand that wrote it had been cold or very old, or both. There was a stain on the page near the note, a small circular mark that might have been a drop of rain through a leaky roof, or might have been a tear. "The earth does not give for free," the note read. "The earth trades. You give the earth your sweat, and the earth gives you its warmth." Alara closed the book. She looked out through the broken window at the dark slope falling away toward Coulter Creek, the invisible line where 67 feet of trench waited to be torn from the ground. "All right, grandmother," she said quietly. "I will trade." She blew out the candle. The darkness was complete, and the cold rose from the earth beneath her like a tide, and she lay in it without flinching, and her mind worked through the night, calculating gradients and depths and volumes, the mathematics of survival rendered in dirt and stone. And on the hill above, invisible in the darkness, a figure stood. A man who had left his house after his family fell asleep and walked to the ridge overlooking the creek. He had not planned to come here. His feet had brought him while his mind was occupied with the question of terracotta pipe, and now he stood looking down at the faint glow of a candle in a ruined shack, and when the candle went out, he stood there a while longer, listening to the wind and to the silence inside himself, where an answer should have been. Caleb Hargrove walked home in the dark. He did not know what was coming, but some part of him, the part that understood load-bearing and stress points and the way structures fail when the pressure exceeds their design, that part already suspected that the foundations he had been building his entire life were not deep enough. He went inside and closed the door, and the autumn darkness settled over Briarstone like a hand closing slowly into a fist. She began on the morning of October 17th, and the earth fought her from the first stroke. The topsoil was deceptive. It yielded to the shovel with a softness that almost felt like cooperation, dark and crumbly and smelling of rot and rain. Alara allowed herself one moment of something close to optimism. Then at 12 inches, the shovel struck clay. The sound was different, a dull, flat refusal. She switched to the pickaxe, swung it overhead with both hands, and felt the impact travel through her wrists, her elbows, her shoulders, and settle into the base of her spine like a bolt driven into stone. The clay was dense gray, laced with rocks the size of fists that had to be pried loose individually. Each swing of the pickaxe loosened a chunk no bigger than a man's boot. She broke the chunks free with the shovel, loaded them into a wooden bucket, carried the bucket outside, dumped it on the growing pile, and returned. One bucket, then another, then another. She had learned from her grandmother that the secret to sustained labor was not strength but rhythm. Long work wins by rhythm, not by force. Margaret had said it while splitting kindling, while hoeing garden rows, while braiding hemp rope with fingers gnarled by decades of mountain living. 45 minutes of work, 15 minutes of rest. The rest was not optional. It was structural, as essential to the endeavor as the digging itself. During the rest periods, Alara drank water, checked her tools, assessed the consistency of the soil, and consulted her grandmother's book for guidance on whatever the earth presented next. She did not look at the hillside and think about how far she had to go. She looked at the next bucket and thought about filling it. By the end of the first day, the hole was 18 inches deep. Her hands were raw. The blisters had risen on her palms within the first hour, white and taut and full of fluid, and by afternoon the largest had burst, leaving a patch of exposed skin that wept against the wooden handle of the shovel. She wrapped both hands in strips of cloth torn from an old undershirt and continued. The cloth turned dark with dirt and blood by the end of the day, and she washed it in the creek and hung it to dry and wrapped fresh strips in the morning. By the end of the second day, the hole was 3 feet deep. Her back had begun to seize. The pain originated in her lower spine and radiated outward through her hips and down into her legs, a deep muscular protest that made the simple act of standing upright a process requiring several intermediate stages. Each morning she rolled onto her side, pressed her palms into the dirt, pushed herself to her knees, waited for the spasm to release its grip, then stood. Each morning the negotiation took longer. She ate like someone rationing ammunition in a siege. Dried beans soaked overnight and boiled into a thin porridge. Flour mixed with creek water and baked into flat, flavorless cakes on the surface of the cook stove. She could not afford to eat like someone doing the work of 3 men. She could only eat like someone who refused to stop. Every evening after the light failed and the digging ceased, she maintained Thomas's tools. This was not merely practical. It was sacramental. She sharpened the shovel blade on a flat creek stone, working the edge with long, even strokes, until it caught the candlelight with a dull gleam. She checked the pickaxe handle for the hairline cracks that could turn a tool into a projectile, rubbing lard into the grain to keep the wood supple. She cleaned the spirit level with a soft cloth, blowing dust from the glass vial where the tiny yellow bubble floated in its liquid suspension. When she held these tools, she held the outline of Thomas's hands within her own, and that was as close to comfort as the world was willing to offer. On the third day of digging, they came. Caleb Hargrove and Reverend Whitfield materialized in the doorway of the shack, with the synchronized timing of men who had discussed the visit beforehand and agreed on its purpose. Alara was standing waist-deep in the excavation, her face streaked with clay, her hair escaping its knot in several directions at once. "Good heavens, child," Whitfield exclaimed, his face arranging itself into an expression of patronizing concern that he had worn so often it fit like a well-broken pair of boots. "What is the meaning of this? Are you digging an indoor root cellar?" Alara rested one hand on the shovel handle. "I am improving the foundation, Reverend." Caleb stepped inside, and his eyes did what they always did when he entered a structure. They measured, they cataloged, they calculated. He saw the dimensions of the hole, roughly 3 by 8 feet. He saw the depth, approximately 3.5 feet at this point. He noted the consistency of the walls, which were cut clean and vertical, not the ragged, uneven walls of someone digging aimlessly. He saw the new planks stacked against the far wall and the terracotta pipes leaning in the corner. His mind performed the arithmetic before he could prevent it. Volume of earth removed, approximately 84 cubic feet. Weight, approximately 4 tons. In 3 days, by one person. But the arithmetic ran beneath the surface of his professional pride like a creek beneath ice, invisible and irrelevant to the landscape above. And what emerged from his mouth was the voice of authority, the master builder pronouncing judgment on amateur work. "This is no foundation, girl. A foundation goes under the walls, not in the middle of the floor. You are digging a sump pit. This whole place will be full of water come spring. The trench will run downhill to the creek," Alara said. Her voice was even conversational, the tone of someone explaining a recipe rather than defending a survival strategy. "It is for air, not water." Caleb let the words sit in the room. Air. He tested it against his 20 years of experience and found it absurd. "What foolishness is this? You need a proper stove and a quart of seasoned oak, not a hole in the ground, to let the cold in." He kicked at a clod of dirt on the floor. It broke apart and scattered. "This is a woman's folly. You do not know the first thing about building." Thomas, God rest his soul, he would have known better. The name hit the air between them like a stone striking water, and the ripples spread in all directions. Caleb saw something move across Alara's face when he said it, something quick and deep that surfaced for an instant and then was gone, controlled with a discipline that he recognized because he practiced the same discipline every time he thought about the hand he had raised and lowered in the town hall. And in the instant after Thomas's name left his mouth, Caleb felt a sensation he could not name, a shifting in his chest like a timber settling under a load it was not designed to bear. He had just invoked his dead friend's name as a weapon against his dead friend's wife, and some part of him, the part that knew crooked work when it was in his hands, registered the wrongness of it with a precision that his pride could not override. "My grandmother taught me some things," Alara said. Her voice was quiet, but it was not weak. It was the quietness of a well-set foundation, the kind that does not call attention to itself because it does not need to. Whitfield stepped forward with the practiced sympathy of a man who had steered many lost souls toward the correct harbor. Old wives' tales and superstition. Alara, the Lord provides through honest work and sound principles, not by burrowing in the earth like a badger. I urge you, cease this strange labor. Come to the church. The congregation will find you a place. Mrs. Prescott needs help in her kitchen. There it was, the offer that had been prepared before the council meeting, perhaps before Thomas was even buried. A position in Dorothy Prescott's kitchen, peeling potatoes and scrubbing pots and sleeping in a small room off the pantry, surviving through servitude, her independence dissolved into someone else's household like salt into water. Thank you for your concern, Reverend Alara said. She turned back to the excavation and drove the shovel into the clay with a sound that filled the shack like a period at the end of a sentence that brooked no further discussion. The two men looked at each other. Whitfield shook his head slowly, the gesture of a physician who has offered treatment and been refused. Caleb's face was harder to interpret because two things were happening behind it simultaneously, like two separate conversations being held in the same room. On the surface, agreement with Whitfield. The girl was addled by grief. The project was nonsensical. Beneath a question that had been growing since he first saw the cart tracks at the edge of town, and that now standing in this shack confronted with the depth of the hole and the vertical precision of its walls and the terracotta pipes waiting in the corner, had developed edges sharp enough to cut. They left without another word. On the walk back to town, Whitfield said, "Poor creature. Grief has addled her completely." Caleb made a sound of agreement, but he did not speak words because he was thinking about the spirit level. He had seen it leaning against the wall of the excavation, positioned as though it had been recently used to check the angle of the floor. A spirit level, in a hole in the ground. People who had lost their reason to grief did not use spirit levels. People who were digging with purpose and precision used spirit levels. He said nothing about this observation to Whitfield. He said nothing about it to anyone. He carried it back to his workshop and set it on the shelf of his mind next to the question about the terracotta pipe, and the two items sat there together, and they fit. The trench grew. 2 weeks of unbroken labor transformed the gentle slope between the shack and Coulter Creek into a raw wound in the earth, a long, deep scar that lengthened by 3 to 4 feet each day. Ilara worked from the first gray light of dawn until darkness made it impossible to distinguish the bottom of the cut from the sides. She followed the natural contour of the land, angling downhill, checking the gradient compulsively with the spirit level at intervals of every few feet. 1 inch of drop per 10 feet of horizontal distance. The measurement had to be exact. If the slope was too steep, the air in the conduit would move too quickly and create a cooling draft instead of a warming flow. If the slope was too shallow, the air would stagnate and the system would fail entirely. There was a narrow corridor of correctness, and she lived inside it with the precision of a woman who understood that her life depended on getting the angle right. Her body adapted. The blisters on her hands calcified into thick calluses that covered her palms like leather patches. The muscles in her shoulders and arms, once soft from a life of keeping house, developed a lean, visible definition. Her face thinned further, the bones of her cheeks and jaw becoming prominent, and she looked older than 19, older and harder and more certain. She was not stronger in any absolute sense. She was more efficient. Each swing of the pickaxe contained less wasted motion. Each shovelful of earth was loaded with the minimum energy expenditure and the maximum material yield. She had become, without intending to, or even noticing it, an expert in the physics of moving earth by hand. On the 12th day, at a depth of 6 feet, the pickaxe struck bedrock. The impact traveled through the handle and up her arms and into her teeth. She struck again. The same dead ringing refusal. A third time. The sound was unmistakable. Granite. The same ancient, immovable granite that formed the peaks above the valley rock, that had been in this place since before the mountains had a name. Ilara climbed out of the trench and sat on the edge with her legs dangling over the lip, looking down at the gray stone that had just ended the straight line she had been following for almost 2 weeks. The thought came, not dramatically, not with the force of a crisis. It came quietly, like a guest who enters a room without knocking. A small, exhausted voice behind her sternum that said, "Stop. Climb out of this hole. Walk to the church. Wash dishes for Dorothy Prescott. At least you will be warm." She sat with the thought. She did not fight it or deny it. She let it occupy the space it wanted, and she looked at it clearly, and she acknowledged that it was real. The body was tired. The hands were damaged. The back was a geography of pain. The food was running low. The task was enormous, and the obstacle was literal stone. She opened the book. The pages were dirty now, thumbprints of clay and smudges of dark earth overlaying Margaret's careful handwriting. Elara found the passage she needed near the bottom of a page that dealt with subterranean obstructions. When the earth is too hard, change direction. Water does not punch through rock. Water goes around it. Elara looked down at the granite. Then she looked to the left, where the soil was darker, a seam of clay and loose gravel running roughly parallel to the rock face but offset by about 3 feet. Softer, workable. The trench would no longer be a straight line. It would curve around the obstruction, adding 2 days of labor and 12 extra feet of length. But it would work. She closed the book. She picked up the shovel. She began digging to the left. This was not inspiration. This was not a miracle or a mystical communion with the spirit of her dead grandmother. This was the accumulated knowledge of generations of people who had survived by paying attention to what the earth said when you struck it. Granite says stop. Clay says slow but possible. Gravel says yes, but shore up the walls. Each material had a voice, and Margaret had taught Elara to listen. And listening was the difference between a trench that reached the creek and a grave that went nowhere. Caleb Hargrove was listening too, though he would have denied it if anyone had asked. He had developed the habit of visiting the ridge above Elara's shack at night. Not every night, perhaps twice a week. Always after Martha and Samuel were asleep, always alone, always standing far enough from the shack that he could observe without being observed. He told himself it was professional curiosity, a builder's interest in unusual construction methodology. Nothing more. On his third visit, under a half-moon that painted the landscape in shades of silver and charcoal, he saw the trench for the first time in its full extent. It was longer than he had expected. Over 50 feet running from the shack in a long descending line toward the creek. Not straight, there was a curve in it, a deviation that his eye classified immediately as deliberate. She had encountered something and gone around it. An obstacle, probably bedrock. He descended the hill further than he had before, close enough to see the bottom of the trench where it lay open near the creek end. What he saw made him stop moving and stand very still for a long time. Flat stones laid along the bottom in an overlapping pattern, each one selected for its shape and fitted against its neighbor like the scales of a fish. 2 parallel walls of larger stones running the length of the visible section, 8 inches apart, forming a channel. Across the top, more flat stones creating a cap. Not a drain. A drain would be sealed to carry water. This was open enough to carry air. She was building a subterranean airway. Caleb stood in the moonlight, in the part of his mind that he trusted most, the part that analyzed structures and loads and material properties, began assembling the information. The trench was deep, 8 feet in places, well below the frost line. The gradient was consistent and controlled, not the accidental slope of a random excavation, but the deliberate engineering of a system designed for a specific rate of flow. The conduit connected the thermally stable zone near the creek to the space beneath what would presumably be a raised floor inside the shack. The terracotta pipes were positioned at the creek end, where the junction between the underground channel and the exterior environment needed to be most weather-resistant. He understood. The air inside the conduit would be warmed by contact with the surrounding earth to a stable temperature roughly 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That air, being slightly warmer and therefore lighter than the frigid air above ground, would rise through the conduit, enter a sealed chamber beneath the floor, and spread across the underside of the living space. The colder air inside the shack, being heavier, would sink, be displaced through a vent and exit. Passive circulation. A continuous gentle exchange of earth-warmed air for room temperature, air preventing the floor from freezing, moderating the interior temperature without consuming a single piece of firewood. It was not heating, it was not insulation, it was a third thing, something more fundamental. A partnership between the dwelling and the earth it sat upon, a collaboration instead of a competition. The numbers worked, the physics was sound, and Caleb Hargrove stood on a moonlit hillside and realized that in 20 years of building homes in this valley, he had never once, not a single time, considered the thermal properties of the ground beneath his foundations. He built on the earth the way a man places a box on a table without any thought for what the table might contribute. Every winter, his floors froze and his clients burned cords of wood fighting the cold that rose through them, and he had always accepted this as the nature of things, the unavoidable cost of living in a cold climate. A 19-year-old widow with a dead grandmother's book had seen what he had missed for his entire career. He went home. He sat at his workbench in the darkened workshop. He lit the lamp and took a sheet of paper and a pencil, and he drew. The sketch was precise, rendered with the technical skill of a man who had been drafting building plans for 2 decades. A cross-section of the trench showing the stone conduit at the bottom, the gravel filter layer above the compacted backfill, the sealed plenum chamber beneath the floor of the shack. He drew arrows indicating the direction of airflow. He noted the estimated temperatures at various points along the system. He marked the gradient. He sketched the vent positions. When he was finished, he held the paper at arm's length and examined it, the way he examined all his work critically, looking for flaws, testing every element against his experience. He found no flaws. The design was elegant in its simplicity. It would work. And then the implication of its working settled onto him, like a roof beam placed on shoulders that were not braced for the weight. If this worked, then every foundation he had ever laid was incomplete. Every floor he had ever built was a barrier against the earth rather than a bridge to it. Every winter, in every home he had constructed, families had shivered and burned wood and huddled around stoves while the ground beneath them, the ground that held a stable, usable warmth, went untapped. For 20 years, he had been building half structures, impressive from the outside, but ignorant of the most fundamental material available. Not timber, not stone, not iron, the earth itself. Caleb looked at the drawing. He folded it in half, then in half again. He opened the door of the workshop stove and placed the paper on the coals and watched it curl and blacken and burn. He watched until the last white corner turned to gray ash, and then he closed the stove door and sat in the dark among the tools and the sawdust, and the knowledge that the paper had contained continued to exist in his mind, indestructible, like a nail driven so deep it could never be pulled without splitting the wood around it. He had burned the drawing because keeping it would mean acknowledging what it proved. And what it proved was not merely that Alara Calloway was right, it was that Caleb Hargrove had been wrong. Not once, not about one building, about all of them, about the fundamental relationship between a structure and the ground it stood on, about the thing he had spent his life doing and the thing he had spent his life failing to consider. The ash settled, the lamp went out. Caleb sat in the darkness and did not move for a very long time. By mid-November, the trench was complete, 67 feet from the center of the shack to the edge of Coulter Creek. The last and most dangerous section had been tunneling through the creek bank itself, working in water cold enough to turn her fingers white and clumsy, digging away earth that threatened to collapse with each shovelful, fitting the final terracotta pipe into position with its opening protected by a grate of woven wire to prevent rodents and debris from entering the system. The opening was positioned just above the winter water line, embedded deep within the thermally stable mass of the bank. The creek work had nearly killed her. Not dramatically, not in the sudden way that a falling tree had taken Thomas, but in the slow, cumulative way that cold water and exhaustion conspire to shut down a human body one system at a time. On the second day of working in the creek, her legs went numb from the thighs down, and she did not realize how serious the numbness was until she tried to climb out of the water and her right leg buckled without warning, dropping her face first into the shallows. She lay there for a moment, the water running over the back of her head, and she thought very clearly, if I do not get up in the next 10 seconds, I will not get up at all. She got up. She built a small fire on the bank and sat beside it for an hour, rubbing her legs until the feeling returned as pain, which she welcomed because pain meant the nerves were still working. She finished the creek section the following morning, moving carefully, testing her footing before each step, treating the water with the respect it deserved. She spent the following week building the conduit, 3 sections of terracotta pipe for the creek end where durability was paramount. For the remaining 50-plus feet, the stone channel she had constructed by hand-flat creek stones laid with an overlapping precision that was functional rather than decorative, but that possessed nonetheless a beauty of purpose. Gravel poured over the top of the stone cap, hauled bucket by bucket from the creek bed, creating a permeable filter layer that would allow air to pass while preventing fine soil from clogging the channel. Then the backfill. 40-odd tons of excavated earth returned to the ground, tamped firm with her boots and the flat of the shovel, compacted layer by layer. until the surface showed nothing but a slightly raised mound of soil running from the shack to the water. Inside the shack, the plenum, a shallow rectangular pit 2 feet deep lined with planks sealed as tightly as she could manage with clay and moss. The new floor laid on top rough pine planks resting on joists cut from deadfall timber. 2 vented openings covered with wire grates, one at each end, sized to allow adequate airflow without creating a noticeable draft. The system was complete. Her last task was insulation. She spent a week cutting thick bricks of sod from the tough prairie grass around the shack, stacking them against the exterior walls until the building was banked to the roofline in a layer of living earth a foot thick. She filled every gap between the wall planks with a mixture of clay and dried grass, working the material into each crack with her fingers until no daylight penetrated. She patched the roof with salvaged tin and the last of the tar she could purchase with her remaining pennies. When the first snow fell on December 2nd, the trapper's shack had ceased to exist. In its place stood a low mound of earth that looked more like a feature of the landscape than a human dwelling. From the outside, it was unremarkable. From the inside, it was a sealed, insulated, thermally moderated shelter connected to the deep earth by 67 feet of hand-built airway. The first true test arrived a week later. The temperature dropped to 10 below zero Fahrenheit. In Briarstone, the townspeople did what they always did. They stoked their fires, high-piled wood into their stoves, and endured the cold that crept up through their floors and in through their windows and under their doors. The smoke rose straight into the still frozen air, a dozen columns marking a dozen homes doing battle with winter in the only way they knew. In Alara's shack, the cook stove held a small fire, barely more than a few sticks of kindling and a handful of coals. The interior temperature held at approximately 55 degrees, but the miracle was not in the air. It was in the floor. She knelt and placed her palm flat against the pine planks. Cool, not warm, but alive. The wood held a temperature that was firm and stable, and profoundly different from the lethal bone-penetrating cold of frozen earth. Near the grate, she could feel it, a current of air so faint it was almost imaginary, rising through the wire mesh, like a breath exhaled by something vast and patient beneath the ground. The small thermometer she had hung on the wall near the floor grate read 38 degrees. 38 degrees, rising from 67 feet of hand-dug trench through a stone conduit built on her hands and knees through a sealed plenum and into the airspace beneath her floor. While the world above was 10 below zero, the earth was breathing its warmth into her home. She sat on the floor, her back against the wall, one hand resting on her grandmother's book. She said 2 words very softly, "Thank you." Then she put the kettle on the stove and made tea, and the steam curled upward in the still air of the warmest room in the valley, and outside the wind blew, and the cold pressed down and none of it could touch her. In Briarstone, the consensus on Alara Calloway had hardened into received wisdom. The poor girl will not last until Christmas, Prescott remarked at the general store with the confidence of a man reading aloud from his own ledger. Tragic, but she was too proud for her own good. Caleb stood nearby examining a box of nails he did not need. "That shack has no proper foundation," he said, and the words came out in the voice of professional certainty, the master builder delivering his verdict. "The frost will heave it apart by January, and that ditch she dug probably flooded the whole interior." The words sounded right. They sounded like what a man of his experience and stature should say. But behind them, in the back room of his mind, where the real calculations were performed, the drawing he had burned existed with perfect clarity. Every line, every arrow, every number. You could burn paper. You could not burn comprehension. And every time he said the words, "no proper foundation," the comprehension shifted inside him like a splinter working its way deeper. At night, lying beside Martha in the dark, he sometimes closed his eyes and saw the system complete. The sealed plenum, the stone conduit, the air at 38 degrees circulating beneath a wooden floor while the world above turned to ice. He saw Ilara sitting inside, warm, alive, and correct, reading that leather-bound book in the light of a single candle, and the image was so vivid and so specific that it felt less like imagination and more like prophecy. He rolled over and pressed his face into the pillow and commanded himself to sleep. December passed into January. Ilara lived in her solitude, undisturbed and self-sufficient. She chopped firewood from deadfall near the creek, but consumed remarkably little of it, far less than any household in Briarstone, because the warmth quarter did the work that their stoves could not. She set snares for rabbits and caught enough to extend her dwindling supply of beans and flour into something that would last if she was careful until the spring melt. She read her grandmother's book from cover to cover and then read it again, finding new meaning in passages she had read a dozen times before. The way a piece of wood reveals different grain patterns depending on the angle of the light. She mended her clothes with small, precise stitches, patching the knees of her trousers and reinforcing the seams of her coat. And the mending was not drudgery, but meditation, the quiet work of hands maintaining the tools of survival. She was alone, and the aloneness had changed character. In October, it had been a wound raw and bleeding, the absence of Thomas a hole in the fabric of every day that nothing could fill. By January, the aloneness had become something different. Not comfortable exactly, but familiar, functional. She had built a life that worked. A small and austere and self-contained life in the building of it had given her something that grief had taken away. Not happiness, purpose. She thought of Thomas less often now, not because she loved him less, but because the sharp, immediate pain of loss had settled into something deeper and more permanent, a layer of bedrock beneath the surface of her daily existence. Always there, always felt, but no longer capable of stopping her in her tracks, the way it had in those first terrible weeks. She wore the memory of him the way she wore the calluses on her hands as evidence of what she had endured and what she had built with the enduring. The natural world spoke to her in the language her grandmother had taught her to understand. In late December, the rabbits vanished from her snares, burrowing deeper into the earth than they normally would. The mountain sparrows that had chattered in the bare branches along Coulter Creek throughout the autumn went silent. The creek itself seemed to thicken its flow, slowing the water reluctant as though it sensed something approaching and was trying to make itself small. When the animals go quiet, Margaret had written, "Listen. The earth is trying to tell you something is coming." Ilara listened. She stacked additional firewood inside the shack, though she doubted she would need much. She filled every available container with water. She dried the last of her rabbit meat on strips of bark near the stove. She did not know the scale of what was approaching. She only knew that the earth was bracing, and she would brace with it. In Briarstone, no one braced for anything. Winter was winter. The homes had endured many of them. Prescott held a New Year's gathering and burned extra wood to warm the parlor. Whitfield preached about perseverance. Caleb delivered the finished red oak chair to Prescott's house and accepted the compliment on his craftsmanship. And neither man mentioned the woman by the creek because she had been removed from the active ledger of their concerns. On the evening of January 17th, the sky turned a color that Caleb Hargrove had never seen. A bruised, mottled gray with undertones of purple, heavy, and low, pressing down on the peaks like a weight placed deliberately on a lid. There was no wind. The air was perfectly still. The silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence, a held breath, the concentrated quiet of something enormous gathering itself. Caleb stood on his porch and looked up and felt it not in his mind but in his skeleton, a premonition that bypassed rational thought and communicated directly with the animal understanding of danger that lived beneath all his years of civilized expertise. He looked toward the creek, toward the mound of earth that had once been a shack. And for the first time, the thought that formed in his mind was, not she will die down there. It was she will be warmer than any of us. He pushed the thought away. He went inside. He checked the woodpile. It was adequate for a normal storm. He told Martha the sky looked heavy. She nodded and put an extra blanket on Samuel's bed. Normal precautions, routine preparations, the architecture of denial. Across the valley, Alara stood in the doorway of her transformed dwelling and looked at the same sky. She placed her hand against the doorframe, and through the sod insulation she could feel the earth, and through the earth she could feel something she had no scientific name for, only the word her grandmother would have used, warning. She stepped inside, closed the door, checked the grates, placed her palm on the floor, and felt the steady breath of 38-degree air rising from below. Whatever was coming, the earth would hold. The storm arrived on the evening of January 18th, and it arrived not with the howling fury of an ordinary blizzard, but with a strange, suffocating patience that was somehow more terrifying. The snow began as tiny, hard pellets, not flakes, that struck every surface in Briarstone with a sound like sand thrown against glass, a dry, hissing percussion that continued through the night without variation. The sky, already that bruised and swollen gray, dropped lower until it merged with the landscape, erasing the line between earth and air, turning the world into a single undifferentiated mass of cold and white and falling ice. By morning, 2 feet of snow buried the valley floor, and the fall had not paused or diminished. The wind began as a low, steady moan, the sound of something large and hollow being slowly pressurized, and it built through the day with a relentless mechanical consistency until by nightfall it had become a shrieking gale that reshaped the landscape in real time, sculpting the accumulating snow into drifts 12 and 15 feet high that blocked doors, buried fences, erased roads, and turned the single street of Briarstone into an impassable canyon of compacted white. This was not a winter storm. This was a meteorological event of a magnitude that no one in the valley had experienced or imagined, an atmospheric anomaly that the regional weather records would later document with the clinical precision of scientists describing a catastrophe that had exceeded all parameters. In the years that followed, it would appear in the annals of Montana Territory under the name the Great White Death, a name that was not poetic but descriptive. For 3 days, the storm did not relent. The temperature descended through levels of cold that ceased to have meaning in any practical human sense. 20 degrees below zero on the first night, 30 below on the second. And on the third night, in the blackest hours before a dawn that would bring no relief, the thermometers in Briarstone, those that were still functioning, those that had not cracked as the mercury contracted beyond their range, registered 42 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. 42 below. Combined with sustained winds above 50 miles per hour, the effective temperature on exposed skin was lethal within 90 seconds. The air itself had become a weapon. Briarstone was sealed, entombed. The town existed as a scattered collection of wooden boxes slowly being buried by a white ocean that had no tide and no shore. Each box containing a small, diminishing pocket of warmth that was being methodically consumed by a cold that recognized no boundary, respected no craftsmanship, and operated with the absolute indifference of physics. Inside those boxes, the systems that Caleb Hargrove and every builder before him had trusted began to fail. The log walls, so admired for their solidity, contracted as the temperature dropped, and the chinking between the logs, that mixture of clay and fiber, that sealed the gaps, contracted at a different rate, and the differential opened hairline fissures, through which the wind inserted itself with the focused efficiency of water, finding its way through a crack in a dam. Each fissure was tiny. There were hundreds of them. The cumulative effect was a constant, invisible infiltration of air at 42 below zero into spaces that stoves and fireplaces were straining to maintain at merely cold. The window's single-pane glass and wooden frames became sheets of opaque ice, inches thick, growing inward from the edges as the moisture in the interior air froze on contact with the glass. They ceased to be windows. They became walls of ice that transmitted cold with the same efficiency as the glass they had replaced. But the floors were the killing ground. Every home in Briarstone sat on a foundation dug to the standard depth of 2 feet. Below that depth, the earth was frozen solid. Not to 2 feet, not to 4 feet. The frost had penetrated 6 feet, 7 feet deeper than any foundation in the valley, and the frozen ground had become, in effect, a platform of ice upon which the homes rested. That ice radiated cold upward through the floorboards with a patience and a constancy that no amount of fuel could overcome. The air near the floor in every home was 30 to 40 degrees colder than the air near the ceiling. Heat rose and was pulled out through chimneys. Cold settled and held. The lower half of every room in Briarstone belonged to the cold, and the cold was not leaving. The wood piles went first. Seasoned hardwood stacked and measured and calculated to last weeks vanished in days as families fed their stoves with a frantic, continuous hunger. The wood burned hot, and the heat rose and was lost, and the cold beneath the floors held steady, untouched, unmoved, permanent. Then the furniture began to burn. Chairs first, small tables. Then the larger pieces, the wardrobes and dressers that represented months of labor and years of saving all of it, reduced to fuel in a desperate attempt to purchase one more hour above the temperature at which human bodies begin to shut down. In the home of Henry Prescott, the largest and most impressive structure in Briarstone, the 2 fireplaces and the cast iron stove proved to be monuments to a theory of heating that had no answer for 42 below zero. The downstairs rooms became uninhabitable on the second day, their temperatures indistinguishable from the outdoors. The family, Henry and Dorothy and William and Annabeth, retreated to a single upstairs bedroom and barricaded the door with blankets to trap whatever heat their bodies and a single fireplace could generate. They burned through the woodshed on the first day. They burned the guest room furniture on the second. The red oak chair with the curved back and the four perfect legs that Caleb Hargrove had built, the one that had been placed in the parlor only 3 weeks earlier, lasted 11 minutes in the upstairs fireplace. Prescott sat on the edge of the bed and watched it burn, and his ledgers and his property assessments and the deed to the Callaway cabin were as relevant to his survival as the ash that rose up the chimney and was instantly annihilated by the wind. Dorothy held the children against her body under every blanket and quilt they owned, and her eyes asked the question that Prescott could not answer, because the answer was a number, and the number was the number of hours of burnable material remaining divided by the rate of consumption, and the quotient was not enough. In the home of Reverend Whitfield, the situation had progressed beyond crisis into a quieter, more terrible space. Ruth Whitfield's lungs, weakened by years of chronic illness, could not process air at this temperature. Her breathing had become a thin, shallow whistle that grew quieter with each hour, as though the instrument producing it was slowly being set down. Whitfield prayed without ceasing, his lips moving in a continuous murmur that was inaudible beneath the sound of the storm, a private conversation with a God who appeared to be occupied elsewhere. He had burned his firewood on the first day. On the second, he began feeding his library into the stove. Theology, philosophy, the collected sermons of ministers he had admired, the complete works of thinkers who had spent their lives contemplating the nature of suffering, all of it converted to ash in exchange for minutes of heat. He prayed for deliverance while the pages of Augustine and Wesley and Calvin turned to cinders, and the storm did not answer, and his wife's breathing grew thinner. In the home of Caleb Hargrove, the master builder of Briarstone confronted the catastrophic inadequacy of everything he had ever believed about his craft. His house was the best-built structure in the valley. This was not vanity, it was fact. The joints were tight, the logs thick, the chinking carefully applied, the foundation dug to the proper depth of 2 feet at every corner, verified square, every surface confirmed level. It was by every metric that 20 years of professional experience recognized a superior building. And it was failing. The floor was glazed with ice. Actual ice formed from condensation that had frozen on contact with floorboards, whose temperature was below the freezing point of water. The nails in the walls popped and cracked as the metal contracted, sharp reports that came without warning and that made Martha flinch each time. The timbers groaned, a deep structural sound that Caleb recognized from professional experience as the voice of a building being subjected to forces beyond its design parameters. He had heard that sound once before in a barn on the edge of town, 3 hours before it collapsed. Martha held Samuel against her, the boy wrapped in every piece of fabric they owned, and Caleb looked at his wife's face and at his son's face and felt a shame that burned with a heat the stove could no longer produce. All his skill, all his pride, all his knowledge of joinery and materials and load-bearing and structural integrity. He had built a tomb. On the morning of the 4th day, the fire went out. The last of the burnable furniture had been consumed hours earlier. The interior temperature of the main room was below zero. The bedroom was marginally warmer, insulated by the desperate metabolic output of 3 human bodies, but the warmth was draining from them faster than they could generate it. Samuel had stopped shivering sometime during the night. Caleb knew what that meant. When the shivering stops, the body has abandoned its last autonomous defense against hypothermia. Core temperature was dropping below the threshold where the muscles could sustain involuntary contraction. The boy was slipping. And in that moment, in the frozen silence of his failing house, with his son going still and his wife's tears freezing on her cheeks, Caleb Hargrove saw the drawing, not the paper. The paper was ash, but the drawing lived in his memory with a permanence that fire could not touch. Every line, every arrow, every number, the cross-section of the trench, the stone conduit, the plenum chamber, the airflow rising through the grate, 38 degrees. While everything above ground froze and died, the earth held steady at 38 degrees. He thought of the woman he had mocked sitting in a shack he had condemned above a system he had dismissed as folly, warm and alive and correct, while he knelt in the wreckage of his expertise and watched his child die. The admission came not as a thought, but as a physical event, a structural failure, a load-bearing wall inside him giving way after months of carrying weight it was never designed to bear. He was wrong about the foundation, about the floor, about the earth, about the girl and the grandmother, and the leather-bound book, and the hole in the ground that he had kicked dirt at and called a woman's folly. He was wrong, and the proof was not theoretical. The proof was his son's motionless body and his wife's frozen tears and the ice on the floor of the best-built house in the valley. "I am going out," he said. Martha looked at him from a place beyond ordinary fear. "You cannot. You will die. We will die in here if I do nothing." He dressed in every piece of clothing he possessed, 2 pairs of wool trousers, 3 shirts, his heaviest coat, a wool scarf wrapped around his face until only his eyes showed, leather gloves, rabbit fur lining, boots packed with straw. He took a length of rope from the workshop, tied one end to the porch railing, and coiled the rest over his shoulder. Martha watched from the bedroom doorway. Behind her, Samuel lay under a pile of quilts, motionless, his small face the color of old wax. She did not try to stop Caleb again. She understood in the way that a builder's wife understands after 23 years that when the calculations are finished and the result is unacceptable, the builder either reinforces the structure or he watches it come down. There is no third option. Caleb opened the front door and stepped into a different world. The cold hit him like a physical blow, a wall of air so dense with frost that it felt solid. It filled his lungs with broken glass. It drove ice crystals into the narrow gap between his scarf and his eyelids with the force of thrown sand. The wind struck from the side and nearly took him off his feet, and the snow was so thick and so violently driven that visibility was reduced to an arm's length in every direction. The world had been erased, replaced by white and noise, and a cold so total it registered on his skin not as temperature, but as pressure, as though the air itself had decided to crush him. He turned down an hill, not toward Prescott's house, which was the direction of official authority and conventional assistance. He turned toward the creek, toward the mound of earth, toward the woman he had failed and who he now believed with a certainty that went beyond thought into the territory of bone-deep knowledge was alive. He played the rope out behind him as he moved his only connection to the house, his only guarantee of return. He fell in the first drift, a chest-high wall of compacted snow that he hit without seeing. He climbed over it and fell on the other side. He got up and moved forward and fell again. The rope grew taut at 60 feet, and he tied the end to a fence post he discovered by walking into it, and from there he navigated by the slope of the land, the only directional information the whiteout permitted. Downhill, always downhill, because downhill led to the creek, and the creek led to the shack, and the shack was either a grave or a miracle, and there was no way to know which until he reached it. The journey took nearly an hour, less than half a mile. He fell 12 times. On the 9th fall, lying face down in the snow, he felt a warmth spreading through his extremities that he recognized as the body's final deception, the counterfeit comfort that precedes surrender. He thought of Samuel. He thought of the drawing, 38 degrees. He pushed himself up. He hit the wall without seeing it. His hands found stacked sod bricks, ice-crusted and solid. He had reached the shack. It was indistinguishable from the drifts around it, a mound among mounds with no smoke from the stovepipe, no sign of habitation, no evidence that anything inside was different from the frozen emptiness outside. His heart fell. She was dead. He had been right, and being right had never felt so much like loss. He leaned against the sod wall, his chest heaving, his lungs burning from the supercooled air, and he thought about turning back, following the slope uphill, finding the fence post, the rope, the house, the bed where his son lay dying. He thought about crawling in beside Martha and Samuel and closing his eyes and letting the cold finish what it had started. But his hands kept moving. His hands had always known more than his pride, and they were the part of him that had been trained longest, the part that understood surfaces and structures by touch alone. They found the outline of the door beneath the packed snow. They brushed the snow away. They found the latch. They pushed. The door was not frozen shut. It swung inward with an ease that was almost disorienting after an hour of fighting through drifts as hard as concrete. He fell through the opening onto his knees, and the door swung closed behind him, pushed shut by the wind, and the storm ceased. The silence was immediate and total, as though a switch had been thrown. The roar of the wind, which had been so constant and so overwhelming that it had become a kind of deafness, was replaced by a quiet so profound it felt like a physical substance, like warm water closing over his head. And there was warmth, not heat, not the blast of a fire, a gentle, pervasive, steady warmth that surrounded him and began immediately to undo the damage of the last hour, to coax his frozen skin back toward the temperature of living tissue. A single candle burned on a small table, In its light, he saw her. Elara Calloway sat in a chair wrapped in a wool shawl reading her grandmother's book. A small kettle on the cook stove released a thin spiral of steam. The fire in the stove was barely more than embers, a few coals glowing behind the grate. The pile of firewood stacked against the wall was nearly full, barely touched. She looked up, and her expression was not surprise. It was calm recognition, the face of someone who had been waiting, who had perhaps known in the way that people connected to the earth sometimes know things that someone would come. Caleb pulled the frozen scarf from his face. His beard was caked with ice, his eyebrows white with frost. He looked at the floor, simple pine planks tight and level. He looked at the walls, no frost, no ice. He looked at the woodpile. He looked at the vent grate near the floor and saw in the candlelight the faintest shimmer of air rising through the wire mesh, invisible except for the way it bent the light. He reached out a trembling hand and placed his palm flat against the floor. Cool, not cold, a living temperature, the temperature of deep earth and flowing water and stone that had held its warmth since before the mountains had names. He felt it rise through his palm, into his fingers and up his arm, and it was the most extraordinary sensation of his life, not because it was warm, but because it was proof. Proof that the drawing was correct. Proof that the woman was right. Proof that the earth asked properly answered. How he whispered. The earth, Elara said. The earth is keeping us warm. Caleb knelt on the floor he had said would heave apart in the shack he had called a ruin above the trench he had dismissed as folly, and 20 years of professional certainty collapsed inside him with the sudden total finality of a structure whose central beam has been removed. He saw the grate. He understood the system. He remembered the drawing in every detail, and the drawing was correct, and the woman sitting before him had built it with her hands alone, and it was keeping her alive while he and the rest of Briarstone froze to death in their solid, well-built, catastrophically ignorant homes. My family, he said, and his voice broke. My boy, he is freezing. Elara closed her book and stood. Then go and bring them here. No triumph in her voice, no accusation, no reference to the day he had stood in this same room and kicked dirt and spoken Thomas's name like a curse. Just the quiet directive of a woman who had built a sanctuary and was willing to open its door to the man who had tried to convince her she was a fool. He went back into the storm, following the slope uphill, finding the fence post, following the rope to his porch, bursting through the door of his own frozen house. Martha was hunched over Samuel, weeping silently. Get your coats, Caleb said, and his voice carried something she had not heard in it for days, a sound like a beam being set into place, the voice of a man who has found the solution to a structural problem. We are leaving. I have found shelter. Martha did not ask where. She did not ask how. She had lived with this man for 23 years, and she knew every timbre of his voice, the way she knew the grain of every piece of wood in their house. And this voice, this particular voice, was the one that meant the problem has been solved. Follow me. She wrapped Samuel in quilts and lifted him, and the boy was terrifyingly light, as though the cold had been consuming not just his warmth, but his substance. And she carried him to the door where Caleb was waiting. The journey to the shack was brutal. Caleb went first, breaking a path through the snow with his body, and Martha followed in the channel he created, clutching Samuel to her chest, the wind tearing at the blankets around the boy. Twice she stumbled. Twice Caleb caught her. He did not speak. He did not need to. The direction was downhill and the destination was certain. When they reached the shack, Caleb pushed the door open and guided Martha inside. The warmth enveloped them like an embrace. Martha stood in the candlelight, Samuel limp in her arms, and the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who has been drowning and has just broken the surface. Elara rose from her chair without a word, took a blanket from her bedroll and laid it near the stove. Martha lowered Samuel onto it and knelt beside him and began rubbing his hands and feet with a desperate, focused tenderness. Caleb watched for 3 seconds, long enough to see color begin to return to his son's face. Then he turned to the door. Martha looked up. Where are you going? There are others, Caleb said. He pulled the scarf back over his face and stepped out into the storm for the 3rd time. He climbed the slope again, fighting the same drifts that had nearly killed him an hour ago, following the tracks he and Martha had broken through the snow. He reached the Prescott house and beat on the door until his fists bled through his gloves. He reached the Whitfield house and shouted into the wind until Whitfield opened the door with the dazed expression of a man who has been praying for deliverance so long he does not recognize it when it arrives wrapped in ice and screaming. At both houses, he said the same thing, shouting to be heard over the gale. There is shelter. The girl's shack by the creek. It is warm. Follow the tracks downhill. They stared at him as though he had lost his mind. The girl's shack, the ruin by the creek, the place they had all agreed was a death sentence. But the cold had stripped away the insulation of pride, just as it had stripped away the chinking between their logs, and what remained was the bare framework of desperation. And desperation does not argue with a man who says he knows where warmth is. They followed. Prescott with Dorothy and the children. Dorothy carrying Annabeth and Prescott holding William's hand, both children silent with a silence that was more frightening than crying. Whitfield supporting Ruth, who could barely walk, whose breathing was a thin, threadbare whistle that the wind nearly erased. They followed the broken trail through the snow downhill toward the creek, and Caleb brought up the rear, herding them forward, refusing to let anyone stop because stopping meant dying, and he had not crawled through this storm 3 times to lose anyone on the 4th crossing. One by one they stumbled through the door. 17 people crowded into 12 by 14 feet of space that should have been suffocating but was instead salvation. The warmth met them like hands reaching out, and they stood blinking in the candlelight, their faces raw and disbelieving, crowded together in a room that smelled of tea and earth and the leather binding of an old book. Elara received them without a word of reproach. She brewed tea from the last of her dried mint. She heated the small pot of rabbit broth she had been saving and passed it around in a single cup. She made space near the stove for the children. Annabeth Prescott, 5 years old, crawled to the floor grate and placed her small palm over it and felt the breath of the earth rising through the wire mesh and looked up at Elara with round, astonished eyes. "The floor is warm," she said. Elara smiled, the first smile that had crossed her face in months. "That is right," she said. "The earth is holding us." Prescott, sitting in the corner, heard it. He looked at his hands, the hands that had signed the order, taking this woman's home, and he did not speak. The storm continued for 2 more days. 17 people lived in a space smaller than most bedrooms, sharing warmth and broth and silence, and the earth beneath them held its temperature steady and stable, 38 degrees, while the world above raged at 42 below. The dynamics of that small space told a story of their own. 17 people who had occupied distinct and carefully maintained positions in the social architecture of Briarstone were now pressed together so closely that the boundaries between them dissolved. Henry Prescott, the man who owned half the valley on paper, sat on the floor with his back against the wall, his 2 children asleep across his lap, and he occupied exactly the same amount of space as everyone else. Dorothy Prescott, who had not spoken to Elara since before Thomas's death, found herself sharing a blanket with the woman whose home her husband had seized, and the sharing was wordless and without awkwardness, because cold and survival stripped away the social niceties that made such an arrangement unthinkable in ordinary times. Ruth Whitfield's breathing improved in the warmth, not dramatically, not miraculously, but enough that the thin whistle steadied and deepened, and Whitfield, who had been listening to that whistle grow fainter for 3 days, who had been bargaining with God for each breath his wife drew, sat beside her and held her hand and wept silently with a relief so vast it had no words. Martha Hargrove held Samuel close, and the boy's color slowly returned, a flush of pink, replacing the waxen pallor that had terrified Caleb into his desperate journey. Samuel woke on the 2nd morning and asked in a small, confused voice where they were, and Martha said, "We are in the warmest house in the valley," and the boy accepted this as children accept facts without needing to understand the engineering that made them true. On the 2nd night, when most of the refugees had found whatever sleep was possible on the floor and against the walls, Caleb and Elara sat awake on opposite sides of the stove. The embers cast a low orange light that moved across their faces like the memory of a larger fire. The silence between them was long and occupied the silence of 2 people who have arrived at the same place by very different roads. Caleb spoke first. His voice was barely above a whisper, and it was not the voice of the master builder. It was the voice of a man who has carried something for a long time and has reached the end of his ability to carry it alone. "I drew it. Your system, the whole thing. I went up to the ridge at night and studied the trench, and I came home and drew it. The cross-section, the conduit, the airflow, the temperatures. I understood it." Elara watched him across the dying fire. She did not interrupt. "Then I burned it. I put the paper in the stove and I watched it turn to ash." "Why?" Elara said. "Because if you were right, then everything I built for 20 years was wrong. Every floor, every foundation." I built on the earth, but I never built with it. Admitting you were right meant admitting I was wrong about the thing I have spent my life doing. The fire settled with a soft sound. I nearly spoke at the hearing, Caleb said. When Prescott said the word generous, I lifted my hand. I was going to say something about the debt, about how Thomas borrowed on my advice, about the cabin expansion I drew the plans for. Martha looked at me. She was scared of what it would cost us. I put my hand down. He looked at the floor between his boots, the floor that was saving his family's life. Thomas was my friend. I taught him to hold an axe. I told him to borrow the money. Then he died, and I sat in that room and watched his wife lose everything, everything I helped build and helped pay for, and I did not say one word. The candle flame bent in a current of air, too small to feel. You are not responsible for the tree that fell, Ilara said, but you are responsible for the silence. Caleb nodded. He did not defend himself. He did not explain. He nodded the way a man nods when the level shows him the truth, and the truth is that what he has built is not plumb. A single definitive acknowledgement. Ilara was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke again, and her voice held something that was not forgiveness, but was adjacent to it, something more durable and more honest. Thomas talked about you often. You were the one who taught him that the axe is not for hitting the wood. It is for talking to it. Caleb looked at her. My grandmother said the same thing about the earth, Ilara said. Something passed between them in the dim light of the dying stove across the space between the man who had been wrong and the woman who had been right, and it was not absolution, and it was not condemnation. It was recognition, the acknowledgement of one builder by another across a divide of age and gender and tradition and pride, united by the shared understanding that the best work, the truest work, is done not by imposing your will on your materials, but by listening to what they are trying to tell you. In the corner, Henry Prescott lay with his eyes open. He had heard every word. He lay in the darkness with his wife and children pressed against him and thought about a number. $112, the assessed value of a life. When the storm broke on the morning of the fifth day, the sun rose on a world that had been remade. The sky was a blue so vivid it caused physical pain, a color that seemed too saturated to be real, and the snow lay across the valley in vast, silent, pristine drifts that glittered in the light like a landscape made entirely of crushed glass. The 17 survivors emerged from the mound of earth that had been a trapper's shack and was now something else, something that did not have a name yet. They stood blinking in the brilliance, their faces raw, their bodies stiff, their understanding of the world permanently rearranged. They walked back to their homes. What they found was devastation. Their cabins were filled with a cold so deep it would take days of continuous fire to drive it from the walls and floors. The interiors were rimmed with frost, the windows opaque with ice, the air inside not appreciably warmer than the air outside. Everything they had burned, the furniture, the books, the woodpiles measured in cords, was gone, consumed in a losing battle against physics. In Prescott's parlor, the outline of where the red oak chair had stood was visible as a lighter rectangle on the frost-covered floor, a ghost of furniture that had been sacrificed to the fire. And then they found the dead. 3 families, 8 people, 2 of them children. Found in their beds, frozen, their faces composed in expressions that suggested the cold had taken them in their sleep quietly without drama, the way a candle goes out when the wax is consumed. The Henderson family, all 4 of them, parents and 2 boys aged 12 and 8. Old Mrs. Callahan, who lived alone near the church and who had been too proud to ask for help from anyone, and whose body was found sitting upright in her chair by the stove, her hands folded in her lap as though she had decided to meet the cold, with the same dignity with which she had met everything else in her 70 years. And the Marsden family, a young couple with an infant daughter found together in their bed, the baby between them, all 3. Still all 3 cold, all 3 beyond the reach of any warmth the earth could offer. They had died in homes built on sound principles with proper foundations, homes where every joint was tight and every corner was square, homes that had been constructed by the best builder in the valley with 20 years of skill and absolute confidence. They had died because the best builder in the valley did not know what a 19-year-old woman with a dead grandmother's book had known all along. Ilara went to the cemetery a few days later when the ground had softened enough to accept the dead. She stood before 8 new mounds of earth beside the older mound that held Thomas. She stood for a long time and she did not feel victorious. She felt the weight of 8 lives that might have been saved if her knowledge had been received instead of ridiculed. 2 of the dead were children. The Marsden baby had been 3 months old. She had never seen a winter. She would never see a spring. The cold had not killed these people. Pride had killed them. The communal, institutional, unexamined pride of a town that could not accept wisdom from a source it had already decided was beneath its notice. She knelt beside Thomas's grave, the oldest of the mounds, the one that had settled and begun to grow grass at the edges, and she placed her hand flat on the earth the way she placed her hand on the floor of her shack, feeling for warmth, feeling for the breath of the deep ground beneath the frost. She did not speak to Thomas because she had never been the kind of person who spoke to graves. But she thought about him, and what she thought was, I wish you could see what your tools built. I wish you could see who they saved. Caleb stood a few paces behind her, looking at the same mounds. Among the dead were members of families whose homes he had built. The Henderson house. He remembered building it. Tight joints, square corners, 2-foot foundation. Perfect by every standard he had been taught, and insufficient by the only standard that mattered. 2 days after the storm, the town gathered in the hall, the same room, the same table, the same chairs. But nothing else was the same. The air in the room was different. The way people held their bodies was different. Something had been broken that would not be repaired by time or speeches, only by action. Prescott stood first. He was gaunt-aged, his spectacles sitting crooked on a face that had lost the composure it had worn like a uniform for decades. He did not open a ledger. He did not consult a document. He looked across the room at Laura Calloway, who stood at the back, and he spoke directly to her. I have been a fool. We have all been fools. We valued our pride and our traditions over wisdom that was standing right in front of us. We sent this woman to what we believed was certain death. And in our arrogance, we nearly shared that fate. His voice cracked, and he did not attempt to repair it. Laura Calloway saved my children. She saved my wife. She saved me. The debt of Thomas Calloway is canceled. The deed to his property is returned to her immediately. It is a small restitution for what she has given us. Whitfield rose next. His voice, once so commanding, was diminished, the voice of a man who has discovered that his vocabulary is insufficient for what he needs to say. The Bible speaks of the wisdom of the humble and the foolishness of the proud. I preached those words for 30 years without understanding them. I offered this woman charity when I should have offered respect. I saw a hole in the ground and called it superstition when it was an act of faith more profound than any I have witnessed in my church. I asked her forgiveness. Then Caleb. He walked to the front of the room slowly with the measured pace of a man approaching something important. He turned to face the assembled townspeople, the men and women whose homes he had built, whose trust he had held, whose respect he had earned through 20 years of honest, skilled, fundamentally incomplete work. For 20 years, I have built the houses in this valley. And in the greatest test those houses ever faced, they failed. They were not shelters. They were tombs. I built with timber and nails and pride, but I forgot the most important material, the earth beneath our feet. He turned to Alara. Their eyes met, and what she saw in his was not the condescension of the man who had kicked dirt in her shack, and not the desperation of the man who had crawled through her door begging for warmth. It was the unadorned, unconditional respect of a craftsman who has encountered superior work and has the integrity to say so. I ask you, Mrs. Calloway, teach me how you did it. Teach us all. Alara looked at him. She looked at Prescott. She looked at Whitfield. She looked at the room full of faces that had pitied her and dismissed her and predicted her death, and then crawled into her home and been saved by the earth she had listened to when they would not. She gave a single small nod, and she said 2 words, the same 2 words she had spoken in this room 3 months ago, standing before the council that had taken everything from her. But the words had traveled an immense distance since then. They had traveled through 67 feet of hand-dug trench, and through a winter that killed 8 people, and through the long, dark night in which a man had confessed the thing he had burned and the silence he had kept. The words were the same. Their meaning had been completely transformed. I see, Alara said. That spring, as the snow released its hold on the valley, and the first cautious green appeared in the mud, along Coulter Creek, Alara's shack became something it had never been in its decades of existence. It became a place where people gathered not out of desperation, but out of desire. The builders and the farmers and the merchants of Briarstone came to the mound of earth by the creek, and they came not to bestow charity on a poor widow, but to receive instruction from a woman who understood something they did not. With Thomas's tools, she drew diagrams in the dirt. She explained thermal mass and frost lines and the constant temperature of deep earth with a clarity that made complicated physics sound like common sense because it was common sense, the kind of sense that becomes common only after someone has the courage to demonstrate it. She described passive air circulation and convective flow and the relationship between gradient and airspeed, and the men of Briarstone listened with the focused attention of people who have recently learned the cost of not listening. She showed them how to test soil composition by squeezing a handful and observing how it held together. She taught them to read the slope of the land with a spirit level and a plank, the same method she had used. She explained why the stones in the conduit had to overlap like fish scales, why the gravel filter was essential, why the plenum needed to be sealed, but the vents needed to be open, why the gradient mattered down to the inch. She was patient with their questions, even the ones that revealed how little they had understood about the ground beneath their own homes, because she remembered that she too had once looked at a page in her grandmother's book and seen only words, and it had taken desperation to turn the words into knowledge. Caleb Hargrove attended every session. He arrived first and left last. He took notes with the careful precision of his building sketches, and he asked questions that revealed the depth of his understanding. Questions that Alara answered with a directness that acknowledged his expertise while expanding its boundaries. His 20 years of structural knowledge combined with Margaret Ashford's generations of earth knowledge, and the hybrid that emerged was stronger and more complete than either tradition alone. Caleb understood load-bearing and material stress and the behavior of wood under varying moisture conditions. Alara understood thermodynamics and soil properties and the movement of air through enclosed spaces. Together, they developed techniques that neither could have created alone, refinements that made the warmth quarter system more efficient, more durable, and more adaptable to the specific conditions of each home in the valley. The town rebuilt itself that summer, not from scratch, but from the ground up, which was different and more profound. Trenches were dug, plenums were constructed beneath existing floors. Walls were banked with sod. The work was communal, shared a town laboring together with a unity that had not existed before the storm because it had not been necessary before the storm. Neighbors who had barely spoken helped each other dig. Men who had mocked Alara's trench now dug their own with the same careful attention to gradient that she had demonstrated. The sound of shovels striking earth became the dominant sound of Briarstone that summer, replacing the sound of hammers, and it was a different kind of sound, softer, deeper, the sound of a community literally digging into the ground it stood on and finding beneath the surface something it had not known was there. In the early days of that first green summer, Emmett Burke made the walk from his general store to Alara's shack. He carried a small object wrapped in a piece of soft cloth. He placed it on the table without explanation or ceremony. Alara unwrapped it and found the gold locket, the one Thomas had given her, the one she had sold for $7. She opened it with fingers that were steadier than they had been on the day she let it go. Inside, the pressed Edelweiss flower was intact, its white petals undamaged, preserved in the private drawer behind the counter of a man who had understood without being told that some things are not merchandise. "I did not sell it," Emmett said. "I kept it. I thought you would want it back." Alara closed her hand around the locket, and the gold was warm from Emmett's pocket, and she held it against her chest and gave him a nod that contained more gratitude than any words she could have assembled. She moved back into her cabin that summer. The cabin with the room that Thomas had built and that Prescott had seized, and that was now hers, again its foundation reinforced with knowledge that had been tested by the most extreme conditions the valley had ever produced. She grew herbs on the windowsill, just as she had planned. Just as Thomas had described to Caleb in the workshop on that last visit, his face lit up with the quiet joy of a man building something for someone he loved. Rosemary and thyme and sage, small green lives, pushing up from the dark earth of their pots, reaching toward the light that came through the glass of the window that Thomas had framed and that Alara had insisted on keeping exactly as he had built it, slightly out of square in the lower left corner, an imperfection she would not correct because it was his. She was no longer the outcast. She was no longer the object of pity or the subject of speculation. She was the sage of Coulter Creek, the woman who listened to the earth. People came to her not just from Briarstone, but from settlements further up and down the valley drawn by the story of the Great White Death and the shack that had survived it. She told them what her grandmother had told her in the same practical language, without embellishment or mystification. The earth has warmth. You can use it. Here is how. Some of them listened. Some of them did not. She had learned that you cannot force knowledge on anyone. You can only offer it, and then the winter comes and the winter decides. And on the wall of Caleb Hargrove's workshop, in a frame, he had made himself from pine with joints so tight that no light showed through, hung a drawing. A cross-section of a trench precisely rendered showing stone conduit and gravel filter and sealed plenum and arrows indicating airflow direction, with temperatures noted at critical points, and the gradient marked in his careful hand. It was the second drawing, the one he did not burn. He had made it the morning after the storm broke, sitting at the same bench where he had destroyed the first using the same pencil, working from a memory that was as clear and detailed as the day the original had existed on paper. He had risen before dawn while Martha and Samuel still slept in the bed they had shared in Alara's shack, and he had walked through the fresh snow to his workshop, and he had sat down in the cold, his breath visible in the air, and he had drawn every line and arrow and number from memory. The plenum, the conduit, the gradient, the vent positions, the temperature notations, all of it exactly as it had appeared on the paper he had burned 3 months earlier. But it was a different drawing. Not in its technical content, which was identical, but in its meaning. The first drawing had been made by a man who understood the system and hated what that understanding implied about his own career. The second was made by a man who understood the system and was grateful for the understanding, grateful for the woman who had built it, grateful even for the storm that had broken him open wide enough to let the knowledge in. Beneath the sketch in Caleb Hargrove's steady carpenter's hand, a single line was written, "Built with the earth. Taught by Alara Calloway, spring 1877. He never took it down. In the years that followed, when clients came to his workshop to discuss new construction, he would see their eyes drift to the frame drawing on the wall, and sometimes they would ask about it, and he would tell them. He would tell them about the trench and the conduit and the woman who had dug them, and about the winter that had proved her right, and about the drawing he had made and burned and made again. He told the story not with shame, though the shame was still there, but with the particular honesty of a man who has learned that the most important thing a craftsman can build is not a house or a chair or a table, but the willingness to admit that someone else's way might be better than his own. The drawing hung on the wall until the day Caleb Hargrove died in the winter of 1903 at the age of 75. His son Samuel, who had been 7 years old and dying of cold on the morning his father crawled through a blizzard to a shack by a creek, took the drawing down and held it for a long time, and then hung it on the wall of his own workshop, where it remained for another 30 years. The paper yellowing, the pencil lines fading, but the truth of what it represented as vivid and as necessary as the day it was drawn by a man who had finally learned to build with the earth instead of merely upon it.